Chapter 5. On the other side of the world, Garrett Bauer was adjusting to life as an intern at the Australian Department of Agriculture, and for a kid from small farming town in Illinois, it was both surreal and exhilarating. His first choice internship had been a dream slot at LAT in Silicon Valley, the kind of cutting-edge research place he'd dreamed about and aspired to since high school. He'd nailed 3 rounds of interviews, tackled the interactive coding test with a perfect score, and felt certain he'd locked it down. But no offer came. Garrett, however, wasn't the kind of guy to sit back and wait for life to give him just one option. He'd lined up a couple of backups, and Australia had been the most interesting. It was a chance to take his skills abroad, to push himself further away from the Midwest than he'd ever dreamed possible. His weekends, he figured, would be spent exploring the outback, or maybe even hopping over to New Zealand. The Bureau's promise of hands-on work with the latest in data science and AI had sweetened the deal. Getting this internship hadn't been easy, but Garrett's background in farming had worked in his favor. Growing up, he'd spent summers helping his family's farm, learning the ins and outs of crop rotation, pest control, and machinery maintenance. The skills had been second nature to him, and now, ironically, they'd come full circle to land him in this spot. He knew his parents were proud of him, even if they didn't fully understand what data science or AI were. To them, computer science was as exotic as Australia. Yet here he was, his straw-colored hair and lanky frame stuffed into a 4x4 gray cubicle, one of many in a row, each barely wide enough to spin a chair, the walls low enough for him to see the heads of other interns and employees popping up like prairie dogs. There was no innovation hub, no futuristic lab like he'd imagined. Just an office with a faded carpet, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the steady hum of old air conditioning. For Garrett, who'd grown up with wide-open skies and fields as far as the eye could see, it was a strange, cramped place. And while he was thrilled to be here, in Australia, he couldn't help but feel a little homesick. He missed his family, the smell of freshly turned soil, and the steady routine of home. But he wasn't about to let that hold him back. Socially awkward as he was making an effort with his coworkers, even if they found him a little quiet, a little odd. Garrett figured he'd earned this position, and he was determined to make the most of it. Martin Dempsey, Garrett's manager, occupied the cubicle directly next to his. And while the setup was far from glamorous, Martin's cubicle backed up to a window. A tiny upgrade in status that said, not quite the bottom rung, though nowhere near the closed-door offices of the real decision-makers. They were the ones free to sip their coffee in private, their heads never visible above the walls like bobbing balloons. In a place where hierarchy was reflected in seating arrangements, Martin's window view was less a privilege and more a reminder of how far he had yet to climb. It was January, peak summer in Australia, and Garrett couldn't help but notice the way the sun slanted through Martin's window, casting an unflattering spotlight on his manager. The light outlined Martin's large, translucent ears, his short-sleeved button-down shirt steadily darkening with sweat stains pooling under his arms. Even his thin comb-over wilted in the heat, flattening against his scalp in thin, damp patches. Garrett had a kind of detached sympathy for Martin. It wasn't that he was a bad guy, but Martin had a way of blending into the bureaucracy around him, a cog in a machine that didn't give him any real sway. In Garrett's eyes, Martin's lack of influence made him a fairly unremarkable figure, but he was a good enough manager and, at times, seemed to genuinely want Garrett to succeed. Today, though, Martin was forcing Garrett to sit through mandatory agriculture training, a thinly veiled exercise in government protocol that neither was particularly invested in. Being just a cubicle away, Martin could easily keep an eye on him and made it clear that he expected Garrett to log on and give it his full attention. Dutifully, Garrett clicked into the Zoom call, watching as a faceless scientist droned on about germination rates, pesticide rotations, and the specifics of GMO regulations in Australian agriculture. He tried in that first session a few weeks back to take it seriously. He'd even brushed his hair and put on a button-down shirt, figuring someone would care about appearances. But no one had noticed, and after a while the whole process felt like a box-checking exercise. This time around, he didn't even bother wiping the Pop-Tart crumbs from his t-shirt. They only needed to see his face on camera to mark him present for the training, and it wasn't like anyone would care if he was engaged. In hindsight, though, Garrett's decision to tune out would prove to be a costlier one than he could have anticipated, one that might have saved him from his eventual role in Stella's untimely death. With the volume on low and the zoom window minimized, Garrett decided to make better use of his time by diving into something that interested him. He opened his browser to the GitHub page for LAT, his dream company, and eagerly scanned the new open-source repositories. Typing AI into the search bar, he quickly pulled up a list of the latest projects, scanning each one with a mix of envy and admiration. Alex Nova, AI Code Optimizer. Bright Minds, Vision Enhancer. Data Pulse, Analytics Booster. Next Gen Tech, Speech Synthesizer. Quantum Forge, Image Classifier. Neuralnetic, Recommendation Engine. Synapse Logic, Language Processor. Cortex Flow, Data Cleanser. Stella Everdeen, The Penguin Games. Vivid AI, Pattern Recognizer. The Penguin Games? Garrett squinted at the screen. Odd name for something coming out of LAT. Garrett had stumbled on a few repositories from Stella Everdeen before. She was practically a legend in the field, well regarded for her sophisticated approaches to security algorithms and time series analysis. He's studied her projects more than once, almost like a quiet fan, genuinely impressed by her data chops and her ability to wrangle complex information into something refined and powerful. So when he spotted the Penguin Games in the LAT repository, he couldn't resist taking a closer look. He clicked in, his mouse hovering over the README file. The project description was enticing enough to grab him right away. A neural network designed to pick out individual objects from data in real time. Not just differentiating types, but identifying specific individual penguins. And then there was the kicker. The program didn't just identify penguins, it named them. Garrett squinted, running his fingers along the line. Unique names assigned to each penguin generated through a large language model, he muttered to himself, his voice thick with skepticism. The whole idea was soft, squishy, humanizing. The kind of thing that would make people coo over a creature on a screen. But AI wasn't supposed to be soft. It was supposed to get things done, crunch data, solve problems, and let humans get on with the important stuff. This, Garrett shook his head, the smirk stretching wider. Assigning names, giving them personalities, it all felt a little too emotional. As if people wanted to make AI into something it wasn't meant to be. For him, AI was a way to automate, streamline, and make repetitive tasks disappear in a few clean lines of code. That's why he'd spent years learning this. Why he'd gotten into programming in the first place. Not to play around with naming animals like they were characters in a kid's show, but to harness AI as a tool that served a purpose, making life easier, faster, and more efficient. When he reached the funding note at the bottom of the README, National Geographic, it all clicked. Of course. They'd want people naming penguins, assigning quirky traits and human-like charm to cold data. This wasn't about AI for AI's sake. It was about selling a story. dressing up algorithms in a cute outfit for public appeal. He couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and irritation. Stella was a genius, no question there, but he never expected her to be the type to jump on the humanized AI bandwagon. He closed the README with a huff, shaking his head. AI, in his opinion, was here to make life smoother, not to give people imaginary friends in Antarctica. Automate tasks, get results, move on, he muttered to himself. Satisfied, he closed the repository. With a glance, he checked the training video on Zoom. The scientist was still droning on, now with an inexplicable slide of a kangaroo beside him. Garrett returned to his browsing. For his internship, Garrett had been tasked with predicting and normalizing output expectations for local crop production. For days, he sat at his desk, combing through data, matching crop types with actual yield figures. The task boiled down to a simple exercise. Take numbers from the database, run basic math, turn it into code, and create a bare-bones interface that would show what farmers had planted versus expected outcomes. The goal was to help the planning team set more accurate expectations for next season. Anyone with a basic handle on acreage, planting yields, and linear algebra could do it. And so here he was, wasting his brilliant mind on grade school farming math. Garrett had finished his project and submitted the code to Martin the previous week. Martin should have been thrilled. Garrett had delivered everything the department needed for next year's crop planning, complete with calculations and algorithms that could streamline output predictions. But thrilled he was not. Martin hadn't wanted an intern in the first place. An intern came with funding, yes, but funding that his boss could redirect towards other, more pressing projects. Martin had agreed to host a student only because it meant extra resources for the department, and so Garrett found himself with no new instructions and a lot of free time. Garrett sat back in his chair, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling tiles above him. Free time. It was supposed to be a luxury, especially here on the other side of the world, farther than anyone in his family had ever traveled. But instead, it felt like being left out in a field with no map and no compass. He felt the ache of homesickness creeping in, a longing for the Midwest skies, for his family's farmhouse, and the way the land stretched wide and open, and free from the fabric-sided walls currently corralling him. Not one to let his mind atrophy, Garrett was determined that this unexpected freedom would work in his favor. He had no intention of putting calculated crop yields as the sole bullet point on his summer internship resume. No, if he was stuck in this intellectual desert, he would take matters into his own hands and pursue something far bigger. Maybe, he mused, he could tackle the problem of food scarcity across Australia. Figure out what is causing lower than expected yields. The reasons couldn't be that different than what he saw back home. Probably drought or soil content or some regional fungi. The idea thrilled him. That would certainly be worth a mention in the academic journals. Maybe it would even get him on the Forbes 30 under 30 list. As soon as the training call ended, Garrett decided to press Martin on his new idea. "What are you planning to do with the crop output data?" Garrett asked, peering over the top of the cubicle wall, his voice unfiltered and direct. Martin rubbed his hands over his deeply lined face, suppressing a sigh. He'd seen this coming. For the past week, Garrett had been gently asking for more work, and Martin had given no thought whatsoever to investing in a new project. Martin rubbed his hands over his deeply lined face, suppressing a sigh. He'd seen this coming. For the past week, Garrett had been gently asking for more work, and Martin had given no thought whatsoever to inventing a new project. The truth was, he had more important things to do, like avoiding everything he possibly could. Avoidance was practically an art form for Martin. Avoiding the intern in the cubicle next door, avoiding his boss, whom he hoped would forget he existed, and most of all, avoiding work. "Nah, mate, not my job to do anything with it," Martin replied at last. "It all goes up to the planning board. They're the ones who decide what crops get the funding." Garrett's nose wrinkled in disbelief. "That doesn't make sense. Why not try to reduce crop loss proactively?" Martin spun his chair around, reluctantly facing the young man whose curiosity had already become an unwelcome fixture in his day. "I'm sure someone's thought of that, but it's way above my pay grade," he replied, with as much patience as he could muster. But Garrett's mind was already racing. "What if I set up a regressive root cause analysis?" he suggested. "I could link all the data sources we have access to and look for correlations with the yield failures." Martin blinked. He wasn't exactly sure what the kid meant, and it certainly didn't sound like the kind of thing he wanted to deal with. But if it would keep Garrett busy and out of his hair for another week, he was willing to nod along. "Yeah, okay," Martin said as casually as possible before spinning back to his computer screen. As far as he was concerned, problem solved.